So let's go over some of the overarching themes of this release of TypeScript ESLint. So one of the things that seems to be really like pushed to the forefront of the release notes is the difference between formatting and styling and all the different config changes. So could you walk us through those and like why did you mess with all the default configs so much?
Definitely. I love the flow of conversation. We discussed how change is oftentimes painful. We have fatigue. 3 seconds later, let's talk about why we changed so many things in a breaking way. Because it's good. It's useful. We've learned. I like to think of there being generally 3 concerns that you might have in a static analysis tool that runs in some kind of formatting or linting space. There's formatting, there's style, and then there's logic. I think a formatter should be the thing you use for formatting, something like Prettier or less commonly Dprint in the JavaScript space. Then you have style concerns, which are kind of hard to get right, and it's certainly difficult to make an opinion that works for everyone. Formatting concerns would be things like white space, new lines, semicolons, whereas style would be like, how do you name things? Do you use one syntax for generics or arrays versus another? And then you have actual logic, which is actual bug finding. So the ESLint project has kind of deprioritized stylistic rules because everyone has their own edge cases and complaints about style, and it's impossible to satisfy everyone. And for a while, we in TypeScript ESLint, just out of inertia, had a bunch of stylistic recommendations in our recommended rule sets. As you can imagine, that caused a lot of, to put it nicely, user pain. To put it less nicely, people screaming at us on the internet. So we've split out the recommended configs into recommended and stylistic. That's the first major change. How does that all feel so far?
It seems reasonable.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
So let's complicate it further with 2 more things. One is that we have a lot of rules that are really good, really powerful, but really strict, and not everyone would want them. So we want to give some kind of preset where people would be able to use those rules, but we can't have it in the base recommended one. Otherwise, users would be like, oh my God, linting TypeScript isn't possible. I'm going to go back to CoffeeScript or whatever. So now we have 2 recommended rule sets that don't do stylistic things. There's the actual recommended, and then there's strict. Strict contains all of recommended plus some other stuff. Lastly, some rules require type checking to function. For example, determining whether you, say, created an async promise and handled it appropriately, we need type checking to know whether something is a promise in the first place. So each of those 3 configs, recommended, stylistic, and strict, has a type checked version, which means we now ship a total of 6 possible recommended configs for users to choose from. I don't like shipping 6 configs, but we have not been able to figure out a smaller number of configs that would satisfy people in a reasonable way. So this, I think, is like the smallest set that we can come down to.
And really, so you have these like 3 main categories: recommended, strict, and stylistic, and you have like type checked versions of each. Is the type check inclusive of the non-type checked, or is this like you have to just like enable which ones you want, individually?
It's inclusive, which is actually a change in V6. Previously, V5 and earlier, you would need to enable both, say, recommended and recommended requiring type checking. Now we renamed it to just recommended type checked, which also includes recommended. So, save you 4 or 5 characters there.
Nice.
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I think it's fun. One of the things I've been doing is sending issues, discussions, and PRs to frameworks like Remix and Next, and soon hopefully Astro, to get them using the recommended presets. Now that they don't include stylistic rules, they can do so without risking angering, thousands of internet trolls. So I'm personally really excited about these presets.
Were those projects previously not using a preset just because of the stylistic rules mixed in?
I don't know why, but I suspect it's something to do with that. Also, for a long time, TypeScript ESLint, say, didn't have a major docs website. That happened, I want to say, a year or 2 ago at most. So kind of part of the general trend of educating users and rolling out the recommendations has been, working with major frameworks. It's kind of a virtuous cycle where the more we document, the more we work with people, the more we know how to improve to unlock working with more people and so on. Hooray, frameworks.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just out of curiosity, are you still using, like, in the projects that you work on that use this, are you still using the stylistic rules, or have you started, like, disabling them by default? Curious to know what your own take on this is.
I definitely use the stylistic rules. I use strict on top of recommended, and I use stylistic. I've learned the hard way not to recommend stylistic for a lot of people. For example, we included it in Create T3 app, which is a popular template for TypeScript apps, and people did not like that it enforced using, say, interface over type, or array brackets instead of array of generic. So we disabled those rules in the Create T3 app presets. But for the most part, if it's my personal repo, oh yeah, I'm enabling stylistic and getting all strict up in there. It's great. I'm curious, do you two use stylistic lint rules at all?
I don't think we use them all that much. We have quite a large code base and quite a lot of differing opinions, and I too don't want to argue with people about stylistic rules.
Yeah, we don't either. The big thing is so the approach to at Oxide is to keep things as simple as reasonably possible, and this especially applies with like tools and configuration and things. So if there's a really, really good reason, like it adds a level of correctness or like some, appreciable benefit, then we're like good with adding it. But otherwise, we do try to keep things very, very sort of lean. And then sometimes, it's one of those things where it takes a while to sort of figure out, to get a good intuition if something is making your code base better or not. So, it's like one of those things that maybe people can enable it as warnings if you don't mind warnings and just see how it feels. And
yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, it's tough. I think there is value in standardizing the code base so that a new person doesn't have to question which thing to use. But that value is so much below the actual logical rules that'll say find bugs, and still is above the actual discussion of which stylistic things. For me personally, I consider it much more important to have a style than it is to figure out the exact perfect style given the choice between two almost identical things. Like I really don't mind using type first interface as long as it's just one.
Do y'all remember writing code style guides? It used to be a thing. It used to be like, I remember a job in 2014. Job I had in 2014, there was a code style guide of like, here's how you should write code in our project. And that was, I think, the big thing that I knew about at the time was, what was it? Standard JS? Is that the tool? Yeah. And the people I was working with did not like it. So it was like, we just have a style guide.
Yeah,
we've come so far.
It's amazing Prettier caught on at all. Like we had decades of people like arguing over stylistic things, and then everybody was like, who cares? Let's just use the tool. And I'm kind of surprised by that.
It's so fascinating watching the growth, the now like super high percentage usage of Prettier. I've been on teams where developers staunchly refused. They were completely, totally against any concept of an auto formatter because they needed it to get perfectly right. They wanted two spaces here and an uppercase there and everything. But now it's just standard, right? And I also think Prettier, you can tell kind of from its docs, especially the first few years, what it was a reaction to. Prettier is super into being very opinionated. You don't discuss it at all. And later formatters, such as Dprint, which for those who haven't tried it out, is a very nice, fast replacement for Prettier that's written in Rust. It's used in Dino, for example. Dprint is much more customizable because Dprint is not in the space where it has to convince people to shut up about it and just use the tool. Dprint's now in the space where people are using Prettier and kind of dissatisfied with some of the decisions. Really interesting to see how the project focuses our reactions to the industry around them.
Yeah, we're definitely at the cycle in Prettier where it's like, okay, there are things wrong. How are we going to fix them? Like you see projects like Prettier to like parallelize Prettier and try to make it faster. And you see things like Dprint. I just learned about Dprint yesterday from posts about you wanting to integrate it in the TypeScript repo. Imagine I don't know anything about Dprint. How am I going to replace Prettier, which is like a very opinionated tool, with Dprint and not change every single line and how formatting goes already?
Oh, what a great question. So there are two repos that are getting Dprint added to them. One is the TypeScript repo. So the repo that contains the actual TypeScript language, the type checker and such. That one was done by Jake Bailey, shout out on the TypeScript team. The reason why they picked Dprint over Prettier, from what I understand, and I'm not the primary source here, was two reasons. One is that it is quite a bit more configurable, so they could match the existing preferences much more, which actually makes it, in a sense, a little bit easier of an onboarding because it's fewer changes. And then also because it is absurdly fast. I don't have stats for TypeScript itself, but on the other repo, definitely typed, that we haven't yet converted to, but are starting to. It's an order of magnitude faster, seconds instead of tens of seconds or minutes. So that's incredible.
And the TypeScript repos case had like even another asterisk. The reason why Prettier was so slow is because most of TypeScript is written in one file. Prettier just doesn't work on a file that is that large, so which is just mind blowing that somebody can work that all of TypeScript basically is just in one file.
I know, it's wild. It's such a good counterexample to so much of what we all consider to be good tooling. Like, oh yeah, your file shouldn't exceed whatever, 1,000 characters. No, checker.ts is tens of thousands of lines long, and it is built by one of the greatest development teams in the history of TypeScript. Literally the TypeScript team. I will also say, though, that the TypeScript repo predates ECMAScript modules until also Jake Bailey. Fun fact, a couple of years ago, it wasn't even written in modules. They had to auto-migrate it over. So their git revs ignore file, I forget the exact name, but the file that tells GitHub that certain commits are auto-generated, don't look at them in the history, is slowly growing over the years as they migrate it to newer and newer tooling. Yeah, it's wild. I have found it inconvenient to work in because of the lack of a formatter. So personally, I'm just really excited that it finally uses a formatter.
I feel like I've heard that opinion in other places, though, that big files are okay. And then I saw someone who was like, had a project that was like a really big file, and they just like had a bunch of tabs open to the same thing, just like split across different ways. And it was just like their whole thing was like, I just find and search and replace stuff really easily. And I was like, yeah, but you can do that across many files. Just like, I don't know.
It's different competing project concerns, right? Like TypeScript doesn't need to be as friendly to newcomers because newcomers are probably not contributing to the language itself. And then also it's super performance critical, where they have to use ugly quote unquote hacks to get a little bit of performance using number enums as bitwise enums instead of string literals, because that saves you some number of bytes per node. So they're just a different project than, say, the vast majority of whatever Node or React or et cetera projects.
Yeah, and the order of JavaScript matters, so it's just like they can make decisions about that without it being sort of this black box and deterministic. We're just going to join modules up how we think they should be joined, and like most of the time it doesn't matter, but maybe in their case it does.